Hey everyone, my name is Jake Smeester, the creative content specialist for Amazon Sumerian, and we are excited to be back on Twitch. We've had a little bit of a hiatus for the last couple of weeks due to summer vacations and all that, and so we are excited to be back to be talking about some really some cool demos and some updates to the Sumerian console and the Sumerian editor. And so I just wanted to, let's first look at what we're going to be talking about today, which is a real-time multi-user training app in AR and VR. And so what is that? Imagine that you have a large piece of machinery that you are wanting to train people on, whether that's a jet engine or a large automobile or a tractor of some kind, and multiple people can be interacting with the same 3D model, but one can be in VR, another could be in AR, another could be on desktop. And we're not limiting it to one, but just multiple people can be on different types of platforms viewing and experiencing that same application. And so we have with us today a solutions architect for the Amazon Sumerian team, Chris Schultz. Hello, you are on camera now.
Hey, everybody.
Talk to us real quick about what is a solutions architect and what you all do for AWS.
Sure. So in my role as a solutions architect with AWS, really, I'm working with customers to help them be successful when they're adopting AWS technology. So my specialty is in AR, VR, and Web 3D. So really any AWS services that can power great immersive experiences are technologies that I'm helping our customers work with. And the demo we're going to show really stemmed from one of the things we do as SAs, which is build prototypes to help customers really understand what's possible. And I thought training in particular is an area where AR and VR are really applicable. And so I wanted to explore that space a little bit and show people what it could do.
Cool. One of the things before we do get started, just wanted to mention some updates that we have to, well, first let me grab the URL of this and I'll post this in the chat room. We have some updates to, this is the release notes for Sumerian. And so there are several things. For example, the new preview engine API is out, and so make sure you're checking that out. PBR, or physically based rendering, is now supported in Sumerian. And so there's a lot of new things that we're really excited about, and we have done some streams, and we will try to do some other streams also to look at more of this stuff. So make sure you're checking that out. But with that, let's look at, I guess it's time for the demo.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So
let me switch over to your screen.
Yeah. So really, to set this up a little bit, what I wanted to do was, like I said, explore how VR, AR, and Web 3D might be able to contribute to better training. And I was thinking primarily like enterprise-based training, where you're needing to scale your expertise across a large audience and finding better and more efficient ways to do that. I often think of VR in particular as a really great way to train people on anything that's rare, dangerous, expensive, or uncomfortable to do in real life. So the scenario I chose to focus on was something where you're needing to teach people how to either operate or maintain a heavy piece of equipment. Maybe it's a piece of equipment from a manufacturing assembly line, something you can't easily take offline just for training purposes. So I set myself a time box of 2 weeks to really see how much of the ideas I had about VR and AR-based training I could implement in Sumerian and some other AWS services so that I could help take it to our customers to understand what's possible. So I'll walk you through the scenario of how this works. And then a little later on, we'll share how some of this was built and even share some code with you guys so you can use it in your own projects.
Cool.
So I'll start off by loading up the experience as the student would see it from a student perspective.
And what do you mean by student? Just anybody taking the training?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, it could be in a corporate setting, it could be an educational setting, but the sort of roles that I'm accommodating in this experience are an expert or instructor, and then a set of students who are participating in real time. So I will log in here. So one of the things I wanted to do is make sure this was all secured and protected by user login. So that's what this is here. I'll sign in as the student. And I'm dropped into our virtual training space. And again, this could really have any sort of piece of equipment that we want to train on. I chose a mech because I thought that'd be kind of fun. But you can drop anything in easily. As a student, I have sort of limited controls of how I interact with the scene, but I do control my viewpoint. I can control, what I'm focused in on. And then it's a little boring right now, but once you see the instructor log in here, you'll start to see where the value of the student view comes in.
Cool. So real quick, I have a question about, I think I know the answer to this, but how did you create the secure login?
Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about some of the technologies. The easiest way to create a secure login with the Sumerian experience is to use Amplify, which behind the scenes is using Cognito user pools to give you a way for your users to create their own login IDs, but then you can authenticate them with certain roles. So we have a few tutorials actually on the website that talk about integrating Amplify and Sumerian that I found really helpful when building this piece.
And one of the things I've been working on is updating that tutorial to make it a little bit more clear. One of the things we've just noticed that's interesting about when you're doing integration tutorials is that you're having to communicate with two teams. And so make sure you check out that tutorial because it should be up to date and a lot easier to use. So make sure you check that out. Okay,
Yep.
Back to your screen.
No problem. So I'm going to open a second window, and this is really just so you guys can see multiple parts of the experience going on. Normally, this would be two separate people logging in two separate ways. But I'm going to log in now as the expert or the instructor in this scenario. And this is where things get fun because I get to enter VR and you'll see how that impacts the experience. So I'm going to launch this into VR mode. And one of the things I want you to notice when I do so is how the student view changes. So I'm launching into VR. And the very first thing you notice in the student view is this little VR avatar appeared. So wherever my VR headset is looking, that little avatar is updating. So it's tracking that positioning all in real time. So
And that just looks like it's just a human. That sounds
it's
kinda
just
creepy.
a severed head. Yes,
a human
floating
head
in space.
No, which that makes sense. Okay, now that I can see it a little
Yep.
larger on my screen now. Okay.
Yeah.
Before we move on, I do have a question about. You mentioned a mech. Like, where did you get this model? And I guess it just kind of representing a large piece of machinery.
Yeah, I just wanted
be
something
trained.
that was large in scale because that's part of, I think, the unique value of VR is you can control the entire environment. You can work with anything at any scale. And something that looked fairly complicated. I went to Sketchfab, which is one of my favorite sources to go to for, especially when prototyping, to find models to play with.
Cool.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put on the VR headset to show you the features that the expert actually has at their disposal when leading this kind of training. One thing we're not showing yet is that students can log in through an AR device as well, a smartphone with AR capability. We'll show that a little later once we've done a little bit more in the scene. So I'll do my best not to bump the microphone as I go blind here. So I'm using some things in Sumerian that helped me build this quickly. And one of those things is the virtual reality asset pack, the VR asset pack. So if any of you have used it before, some of these features will be familiar. It automatically gives me the controllers that are appropriate to the headset that I'm using. You'll see these little blue icons that indicate where I can teleport myself. So if I point to a location and pull the trigger, it teleports me to that area. There are some things that I added that aren't part of the regular VR asset pack. So one of the things I wanted people to be able to do is sort of turn their bodies without having to turn their whole physical body, especially for a situation like I'm in right now where I'm in a seated position and it's not necessarily convenient to turn. So on my controllers, if I push the thumbstick to the left, it rotates me 45 degrees each time I do that. So that's like a little convenience feature that I added that wasn't part of the default asset pack, but was something that I thought would be useful.
And for anybody interested in learning more about the VR asset pack, we also call it VRAP sometimes. That is, I just posted a tutorial in the chat room, so check that out.
So it's a little hard to tell, I think, if you're seeing it on a 2D screen, but this mech is about 15 feet tall. It's huge in front of me. And let's say I want to start talking about the features of this piece of equipment with my students. One of the things I've done is provide the instructor with some VR-centric tools. So if I looked at my left-hand controller here and I just tilt my wrist, it reveals this little pop-up menu with different tools I can use. So that was a nice feature and something, that takes advantage of the uniqueness of a VR experience, that we can make things appear and disappear whenever we need them to. So I've got 2 tools here. You could imagine there being a whole palette of tools that get added over time. But the first tool I'm going to use is this laser pointer tool. So the other thing that isn't part of the standard asset pack that I added, you'll see this sort of shining orb at the end of my VR controller. I wanted a way to have a more hands-on manual feel when interacting with the environment, so I can use that orb to pick things up just by squeezing the little grip button on the side of my controller. So I'll put the orb into the laser pointer, squeeze the trigger, and now I've got a virtual laser pointer. And you'll notice if you look at the student view that's on screen, every action that I take is being updated there as well.
Yeah.
So this laser pointer, the idea is the data is sort of being synchronized across all the connected users, but it's not being recorded. As soon as this live training is over, that data, it doesn't exist anymore. But another feature I wanted to add was the ability that as an instructor is imparting wisdom onto their students, they can leave behind information that actually does persist in the experience. So if a student wants to come back to the experience later and review it, they can. So that's where this other tool comes in, this info pin. So to use that,
and you created all those from scratch, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I created them in a reusable way so they could be easily used in other VR projects in the future. So I'm going to use that info pin. I'll show you how it works first. So I reach in and I grab it, and it pops up this bigger version. And you'll notice there's a prompt at the top that says I can press and hold the indicated button to dictate a message. So the idea is each of these pins would have some text behind it that the instructor could record just through dictation. So I've got a button on my controller marked dictate message. So if I hold that down, it will listen to what I'm saying. Now this feature actually isn't implemented. I couldn't implement it in the 2 weeks I gave myself, but you kind of get the idea. It would be using something like Amazon Transcribe on the back end to turn my voice into text that then gets associated with this piece of training equipment here. So I can just release the pin and it stays wherever I position it. I can pick it back up and make adjustments later if I need to, maybe. Let me move closer to over to the side a little bit. So one of the challenges with working with a big piece of equipment like this is I can't reach everything that I need to talk about, right? So I've provided a couple different ways to work around that. One is on this controller, you see scale up and scale down buttons. So if I'll take a step back actually so you can see it a little better. So if I press the scale down button, you'll see the mech changes its scale and shrinks. And it shrinks in different increments. So once it's small enough, I can now reach things more easily. So I'm going to take another one of those pins and I'll place it somewhere on my mech. I'll move myself back a little bit. Maybe take another one, scale them down a little bit more, and put that right there.
And just to clarify, these pins are like info markers.
Yep, and we'll see how students would access those. I apologize that I can't get rid of this pin right here. It might block your view a little bit. But these pins, so now if I scale up, let me scoot over a little bit, scale up the mech again, you'll see that the pins stay attached exactly where they were. The other thing that's kind of unique about this is the pins always remain the same scale, even though the mech's scale changes. So that they never get too small to see or too large that they look out of proportion. So that's the basic interactivity. The only other thing I wanted to show was I mentioned that you put scaling in here as a feature to allow you to reach things that were difficult to reach. Another thing I put in here, almost as just a fun Easter egg, is what I call jetpack mode. So on my controllers, if I pull back on both thumbsticks at the same time, it will enable jetpack mode. And if I push up on one of the thumbsticks, now I can sort of levitate myself to a new height. And one of the things you'll notice is as I'm moving in this fashion, it sort of gives me a little bit of a tunnel vision. That's a technique for helping avoid any motion sickness that the user might get. It's an idea that I first saw used in the excellent Google Earth VR and thought it was a great kind of solve for giving people freedom of motion without having to rely just on teleport.
So you move yourself up, and then you remain there until you move back down.
Correct. You can still, while I was up in the air, I could still use the teleport feature, and it would still work as expected, but it would just always keep me at that super height.
Gotcha. That's cool. It's fun watching this on the desktop.
Good.
Too.
It's fun watching it in VR. So let's
fun watching you do it in VR too.
And only a couple mic bumps in that
right.
whole
Yeah,
demo.
you're doing good.
So let's switch over to the AR view now, so you can kind of see how that experience looks.
Okay, so we are switching some.
Little technical switch over here.
Are you doing okay? I hear some odd audio.
That's my jetpack sound.
Oh, okay. It's like what is happening?
Off, yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So let me.
While we're doing this, I'll ask you a question. We just popped up in the
please.
chat room. Is the sync data between users using AppSync or something else?
It is using AppSync, yeah, and we can talk a little bit about AppSync because there's some interesting challenges when using AppSync that I had to sort of address when building this.
Yeah, good question, Philip Wan. We will get to that more in depth in a minute. All right, so now we're switching to your phone.
Yep. So
what is C-Look?
So I'm using the C-Look app on iOS, which is a fantastic app, especially when you're sort of iterating on your AR experiences with Sumerian. It's basically an app that you just paste a Sumerian link in, and it enables ARKit functionality within Sumerian. The other way you can approach it is we provide some templates for an Xcode project where you can build your own iOS application and load your scene into it. But for those who may not be familiar, the browsers don't yet support AR natively inside the browser, so you need some sort of mechanism to enable that AR tracking. So we're using C-Look in this case.
That's not just a Sumerian thing.
No,
it's
just a browser thing.
Browser thing across all major devices.
Exactly. So I'll go ahead and load up this project. And Jake, would you slide back a little so we can make room for this guy? So the first thing, if I move my phone around a little bit, it's going to put this little placement marker here. So I just choose where I want to center my AR world, and I tap on the screen to place my mech. And so you'll see Jake's in there with, with the mech. And you'll see those little info pins we place. So if I touch on any of those info pins, it calls up that text that I would have dictated. And one of the features of this text, too, is that it always faces the camera. So it's always sure to be, no matter where the user is positioned, they're always sure to be able to read the text. The other thing you'll see is our little avatar guy is still there. And I'll see if I can use both of these things at the same time. So you see as I move my little avatar and headset around, it's still tracking even in the AR space. Yeah, so the idea is with the AR view, it gives you complete freedom of motion as if that machine were really in the room with you. We're displaying it at a sort of third scale size just because this would be too big to fit in the room, but you could give the user control over that scale as well.
Right. That's very cool. Awesome. Okay. Great. So that kind of wraps up the actual demo, right?
So that's the overall demo, yeah.
So in general, what we have here is really the ability to look at a piece of machinery, a 3D model, and be able to place pins on that, like information pins with information about to describe what that is. And you could obviously add in a lot more functionality. Yep. I mean, that's kind of a basic thing. The really cool thing is that you could watch, multiple people could be experiencing this in AR, VR, or a 3D desktop experience, and all be learning at the same time from the instructor.
Yeah.
That's really the cool thing, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, certainly. And there was a long list of features that I didn't have time to put in there that I would have loved to. One thing that I think would be really compelling is giving the instructor the abilities to sort of trigger pre-built animations on that machine. So imagine if you're, working on some equipment where you have to remove a hatch, he could trigger that animation so you could see inside the machine and that sort of thing. So lots of potential there. Again, I was limited just by the time I gave myself to work on this, but was really happy with where it ended up, and I've gotten a lot of good feedback on it as well.
Yes, as somebody who's heard many people say, "Have you seen what Chris built?" Very impressed. Okay, great. So now we're going to switch over and look a little bit into some of the services.
Yep.
Is that what we're going to cover next?
Yep.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the services that were actually. Oops, we got to switch back to your screen here. All right, here we go. And all right, so let's talk about some of the services that were actually used in building this application.
Yeah, so some of these will probably be pretty familiar to folks who have gone through some of our tutorials, because they're sort of the common contenders that pair really well with Sumerian. So obviously, Sumerian is used as our 3D rendering engine, and to give us that AR, VR, and Web 3D functionality. It's also how we can easily distribute the app to multiple users so that all they need is a URL to access it. AWS Amplify, if you haven't used Amplify, it's kind of it's a set of developer tooling that makes it really easy to add new functions to your application. So a perfect example in how I used it in this experience was I wanted to add user management and login capabilities, which normally if you're rolling that by hand on your own, it's a lot of work. You have to do all the UI stuff. You got to do all the back-end logic to handle all the different cases. But with Amplify, it's literally a command line you execute, and it adds all that stuff to your project for you, and even helps handle the deployment to the servers. So it's a super easy way to add things like enhanced security to your applications. So used Amplify for that piece. Cognito is what we're using to manage the users themselves. I chose to make it so any user could create their own account, but you can limit that if you want to. AppSync is sort of the key to that multi-user, that real-time synchronization of all the different things you saw happening in all the experiences. And then behind the scenes, AppSync is actually writing certain data to DynamoDB, the database. That's any of those info pins are stored in Dynamo. And I'm storing just a few pieces of information about each. I'm storing its position in 3D space, its rotation in 3D space, and then a name of the type of component it is. So one of those names might be info pin, so that it knows to, when I add an info pin in the instructor view, it knows to add info pins to all the student views as well.
I have a question about, so you added info pins to certain spots. Are those tied? I mean, I know you had, I guess, what's it called? Lorem ipsum. Mm-hmm. What am I trying to say?
Greeking text.
Yeah, that thing. So there wasn't actual information right there, but could you make it so that when you place it on the shoulder, that it is smart enough to actually pull information from Dynamo to say, okay, you placed a pin on the shoulder, so now we're going to pull up information about the shoulder and display it there.
Yes, you definitely could. In fact, just kind of thinking off the cuff here, one way you could do that is you could have the different pieces of the machinery. You could use the tags feature in Sumerian to tag those individual components. And that way it knows when you attach it to a thing marked right shoulder, it knows to call the database and pull up the information from maybe the user manual that talks about right shoulder.
Okay, cool. So there's something that wouldn't have to be decided, or it wouldn't have to be built in, or...
Yeah, it wouldn't necessarily have to be created on the fly.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah. I'll show you just another view of how these pieces fit together for those who are interested. So, Amplify, I kind of view it as a wrapper that helps you combine Cognito and Sumerian, and also takes care of pushing things to the cloud for you. App sync is really something that happens behind the scenes, and it's coordinating all of the messages between all the connected clients. And app sync uses two important things to know about. GraphQL is sort of a query language that AppSync uses to know how to write things to a database or look them up from a database. And it's to JavaScript developers, I think GraphQL is a very approachable and familiar kind of pattern because it looks like JavaScript objects, so it's very intuitive. And then things called resolvers, so that kind of helps determine, should this get written to a Dynamo database, should it go to some other service, or should it just be echoed out to all the connected clients? So this is how conceptually those pieces all fit together. Another helpful way to look at it is what's really happening when the instructor places a pin. So the sequence of things are the instructor takes an action. In the case of this demo, it's not until the instructor releases the pin that it sort of gets replicated across the whole system. So they take the action, that goes to AppSync. AppSync then writes that information to the database so that it's there in the future. And when that's complete, then all the other connected clients get an update message that says, hey, a new pin was added at this position with this rotation. So that's kind of how it works in a high-level sequence. So yeah, that's as much as I wanted to dig into the architecture, unless anyone has additional questions.
I will shoot them over to you if and when we do. Yeah. But yeah, let's continue on. So I guess the next thing to talk about is some of these scripts that like reusable and shareable scripts that you have been kind enough to share with. So I'm going to actually put that in the chat room.
Yeah, excellent.
So let's talk about what are some of the handful of the scripts you would want. Well, there's a lot of scripts in here as I'm trying to
There are
talk.
a lot of scripts in here.
So I'm just providing an S3 bucket that has, I didn't actually open it up. It's just a bunch of JavaScript files, correct?
Yeah.
So a bunch of JavaScript files written by Chris. And you can take those and pull those and use them really however you want. And gosh, how many are there in there?
Roughly 12, maybe.
Okay,
yeah.
So let's talk about maybe the top 2, 3 that you want to cover. And of course, we're not going to be able to go through all 12 scripts. But again, you can find Chris or myself. Chris is the expert, but I can also kind of help facilitate those conversations. You can find us on Slack, AWS-Jake, AWS-Chris. With a K, and you can find us, and we can, if you have any follow-up questions, you can obviously ask us there.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump back to your screen and look at some of these. I got to move your body to the other side of your screen. There we go.
So yeah, this is the list of scripts that I'm providing. So with any project I work on, I always try to look for opportunities to modularize things so that they can be reused. And Sumerian's actually really great about that because you can add scripts just through drag and drop to an entity, and you can actually add multiple scripts to a single entity. So that lends itself really well to dividing up your functionality into very narrowly focused scripts, which tends to lead to better reuse. So this is a list of all the things I thought other people might benefit from having access to. Like Jake said, we'll probably only have time to go through a couple of these, but the quick highlight is there's a couple in here in particular, if you're getting into AR, that I know a lot of people have asked me about is, how do I create that functionality where there's a little marker on the ground and you can position it and tap the screen. These two scripts give you a drag and drop solution for doing that. So definitely use those and let me know if you have questions. There's a few VR specific things in here as well, but I think we'll start with some more generally useful stuff, starting with this view mode visibility script, because I think this is a simple script, but it really shows the power of reusability in Sumerian. So one of the choices I made when implementing this is I didn't want to have 3 different scenes for each view mode. So a VR scene, AR scene, and a desktop scene. I wanted it, since 90% of the functionality was going to be common across each mode, I wanted to build it and maintain it in one scene. So in order to do that, I needed an easy way to sort of hide or show things based on which mode the user was in. So if I select my room here, which is just the background behind this guy, it only makes sense to show that in certain modes. So you can see this view mode visibility script just provides simple checkboxes where I can say, yes, I want to display this in VR. I want to display it in non-XR context, like if a person's viewing on their desktop, but I don't want to display it in AR. So literally you just drag and drop that script, turn on the checkboxes you want, and you're done. So super useful. It's not a particularly complex script if you were to actually look at it. It's pretty short, but it did take some time to even figure out how to know what view mode someone was in. So it's really nice to have that bundled as a reusable piece. The other one that I think is really useful, so if you've played it all around with actions in state machines or there's script API for doing this too, you can have one entity sort of reorient itself so that it's facing a target. And that can be really helpful. In my case, you saw those text boxes that were displayed on screen that I always wanted to have them face the user. But by default, they'll pivot on all their axes to face the user. So if the user is above the thing, it will pivot up. And I didn't want that. I wanted it to just pivot around the y-axis. So that's where this script comes in. So I'll show you an example of this. So I'll just add a box here so we have something to look at. And I'll take that script, which was called enhanced look at, and drop it right onto that box. So the first thing it needs is a target entity to look towards. So I'll just pick my default camera. And then I can lock it so that it doesn't rotate on specific axes. So I don't want it to rotate on X and I don't want it to rotate on Z. So now if I run this, you'll see wherever I turn the camera, the box always rotates to face the camera, but if I go above, it doesn't pivot upwards. So that's exactly what I want. And as sort of an added bit of polish, there's also this option called smoothing factor. So if I put in, say, 0.3 there, what that does is it adds a nice subtle little animation when it's pivoting so that it doesn't look like it's completely locked to the camera. So you can see if I move quickly, it takes a little time to catch up to the camera.
There is I thought there was a state machine action that did that.
There is this, if I remember right, there's an action for look at, and it does support the animation piece, but what it doesn't support, I don't think, is the ability to lock it so that it only pivots around one axis. That's the difference.
Gotcha. This is probably going to annoy you a little bit, but
No.
something I'm very excited about is the fact that I did not know that you could just drag a script onto the inspector panel and it adds the component along with the script.
I discovered that by accident, and I was very happy with it myself.
I know. I was like, all these tutorial videos I've made, I'm instructing people to, well, first you got to add a component, and then you add this and this. So much easier. That's for me, this is huge.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we've got a bunch of different things here. I don't know how we're doing on time, Jake, if we got time
We're
to
at
go
34
through
minutes. Let's do another one.
Okay. Let's see. I think one that would be, I'll show this one just because I think it's kind of interesting. If you download the zip file that Jake posted, you'll see descriptions of all these scripts so you can get to know how they work and what they do for you. I'm going to show one that's a little unusual because I wasn't even sure this could even be done in Sumerian. So one of the things that I encountered when I was working on this was I was having some trouble. I wasn't getting the behavior I expected with some physics-based entities. And what I really wanted to do was get a better sense of all the objects in my scene that were, participating in physics. So I'm going to just quickly put together and add a collider on each one of these so I can show you what this does. Okay, so I've got two entities here now that both have physics colliders on them. What I wanted to do is be able to see how all the entities in my scene, like the pins I have physics colliders on them. But when you're running, you'll see when I select the sphere, it shows the little green outlines of the physics collider. But if it's not selected, I can't see that. So what I did is I created And this quick sidetrack here. This is another technique I use, which I'd love. I've found pretty useful. Is there's some code that you just don't know where to put it because it doesn't apply to just one specific entity. So I'll use empty entities and just attach a bunch of scripts to them so I can find them easily. So that's one tip I do a lot. But here, this physics debug script. All you do is you turn on this display colliders button, and when you run your project, it will constantly display those green outlines for you so you can get a better sense of where the physics are and if you're using the right shaped collider on the right shaped object and all that sort of thing. So it's maybe a very niche kind of thing, but I was just happy to find that I could write a script that sort of added features to the editor that weren't there by default. One thing I'll just mention since I'm on the stream today is the relationship between state machines and scripts, because I've had people ask me about that. I think they're both great, and I think my own approach to them is I use state machines when the state machine is going to get me quickest to my goal, and I use scripts when the script is going to get me quickest to my goal. I also think there's a really interesting dynamic for teams in using both of them together, because state machines are very approachable to people who aren't programmers necessarily. So maybe the more design focused folks on your team, they can do a lot with state machines. And state machines are also useful to developers who want to prototype an idea really quickly, even if they don't end up using a state machine for the final implementation. Where I think you can combine the two is we provide a lot of really useful actions you can use with state machines, but there's always additional things that you're going to want state machines to do that we don't provide an action for. And that's where a programmer can actually write a custom action that then the designer could use in a state machine. So that's another really interesting way, I think, to take the strengths of both and use it to make your whole team stronger, is by combining the two.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about state machines is that for one behavior, it can only be in one state at a time, and that can be useful for a lot of situations. But there are other situations where you want kind of multiple things to be running, and so again, just like with anything, there's multiple ways to do it. There are pros and cons. So there are great reasons to use scripts. There's great reasons to use state machines. Some people sometimes it's just preference. Some people just prefer to use scripts. I mean, I'm more of a not having a developer background, I'm much more of a state machine person. So we have engineers on our team that are not interested in the state machine. They only want to script everything out. Just that's how the mind works.
I'll do a callback to something that Jake mentioned earlier in the stream, which was in July, we launched a preview version of the new engine scripting API. The reason we launched it in preview is because we want you guys to use it and give us feedback on it. And one of the strengths of the new engine API is it takes all of those actions that were available only in the state machines previously and exposes them through code. And that's really powerful because those actions do some pretty sophisticated things that would require you writing a lot of code to accomplish. So now you can use some of those actions that you've found useful in state machines, use them in your scripts, and have a little bit more flexibility to have their behavior change based on different inputs, for example. So I definitely encourage you all to spend some time with the new API. Let us know what you think about it. Let us know what makes sense, what doesn't, and what you think you'd like to see from it in the future.
Right. So I'm somebody is, I don't know how to say the name, so I'm not going to try. But somebody's asking me, who's brand new to the stream, and asking questions, just basic questions about Sumerian, like what is Sumerian? So instead of typing it, I'm just going to go ahead and address this directly. So the question really is what is the focus of Sumerian? Sumerian is, this person asks, is it a game engine? Yes, it's kind of like a game engine, but not necessarily intended for building games. You could build games, but our target customers and our target users are a lot of times businesses, enterprise companies that are wanting to create simulations and training. That's just what this experience or this demo is. There could be instructional design experiences. There could be product configuration experiences. We have these 3D hosts or 3D avatars, people call them a lot of times, that are used for creating digital concierges or digital chatbots with an actual face to them. So there's a lot of different use cases for Sumerian. And so this particular This particular demo is for training in not as much simulation, but I guess training on industrial equipment. So I hope that answers the question a little bit better than just typing it in there.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was a little distracted with that question.
No, it's a good clarification.
When you were talking. So the last thing you mentioned was?
I was just talking about the giving a plug for the new scripting API
right.
to get people to try it.
Yeah, definitely. And the documentation is updated. And so that was one of the things that people said, like the documentation was a little bit tough to follow. And so that's been updated. And so, yeah, I would definitely encourage you. And we will be working on content also to help people get up to speed with that. The current plan is that in a few weeks, we're going to have a stream with the creator of that, the new scripting API, who's going to walk us through some basics of using that.
Yeah, another quick tip on that. You can't get to the documentation for the new scripting API from our documentation page on the website, unfortunately. That only links you to the old documentation. But if you're in the Sumerian editor and you open up the script editor, there's direct links in the script editor itself to the what we're referring to as the legacy documentation and the preview documentation, which is the new API.
Right.
So
Cool.
that's how you get to it.
Well, I think we are out of questions on the chat room. You've covered everything on your end. Again, there's a lot more scripts and stuff. And I will make a plug for Slack. So slack.sumerian.world. You can go there, join the public Slack community. There's like over 3,000 members, lots of people asking questions, lots of people sharing different things. A lot of the teammates from the Sumerian team are actually on there. So myself and Chris included. So join that Slack, ask us questions if you have any follow-ups, and we will try our best to answer them for you. Chris, thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, my pleasure.
For putting this really impressive demo together, not just for your own purposes and for your own customers and for your own learning experience, but also just for bringing it and concisely demonstrating it today here on Twitch.
Yeah.
Cool, man. Thanks for joining. Again, we will be back right now we're scheduling it for 3 weeks, the middle of September. We're going to be talking about the Sumerian new API, so please join us then. We'll hopefully be on our new studio. We are moving, and so we got some moving ahead of me. I got to pack some things up here, so that's going to be fun. All right, that's it for me. Thanks, Chris. We will talk to you and see you all a little bit later. Thanks for joining.